Good afternoon, everyone. I see there are quite a number of people still joining, but while we are joining, I am going to just make the announcements and do the welcoming. So welcome to the second Global Environmental Law webinar. We typically do have a joint webinar with the Dalai Lama Institute. But this specific series of webinars is a GELC-driven webinar, and we have a few events planned for the entire year. This is the second webinar, as I mentioned. So actually last week, we spoke to Professor Jonathan Verschiering from Tilburg University, and he spoke about smart regulation and agriculture and climate implications in that sector. And he spoke specifically about the Netherlands. So that was quite interesting. Today, we are speaking to Amy Wilson. And Amy is the Executive Director and co-founder of Animal Law Reform in South Africa. This is the first dedicated animal law non-profit in the country. Amy is also affiliated to the Global Environmental Law Center. She is a board member, and in fact, she supervises some of the master's students in the environmental law program. Amy is an attorney, and her research focuses on the intersection and interests of rights of humans and non-humans or non-human animals and nature in law and policy. And she considers creative approaches to the attainment of an inclusive system of justice for those groups. Amy is an independent expert with the United Nations Harmony with Nature program and also a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. She is the first South African to graduate with a master's degree in animal law, and she leads a number of animal protection organizations throughout Africa, including South Africa and Kenya. Amy has worked as a fellow specializing in aquatic animal law with the Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, and has worked with UCLA Law, California. She has also worked with several prominent global and US-based animal profit or non-profit organizations. And Amy is currently working on a number of research and writing projects, including co-authoring a book on aquatic animal law and co-editing the first animal law book in South Africa. Earlier this year, Amy co-taught the first animal law course in South Africa. It is safe to say that we do have an expert then on the field of animal law, and I am very excited to welcome Amy. Amy, thank you for joining us today. I know you are joining all the way from Florida in the United States. We really appreciate that you are here. I'm going to hand over to you. If any of the attendees want to ask questions, you are welcome to do so in the chat. However, we will wait until the end of the presentation to address those questions. That's it from me for now. Over to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. van der Berg. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So hi, everyone. I'm Amy. As you just heard, I'm really excited to be with you to talk about the subject of animal law, which is a topic that I'm obviously extremely passionate about, as you can tell from my interests and hopefully also from this presentation. I really hope that you find this insightful and interesting and that it ignites a passion for you for the topic and that you'll do your own further research because it really is such an interesting and fascinating area of law. So I've got quite a lot in my presentation. I tend to always want to include as much information as possible. So some of it I'm going to go through quite quickly, but I hope that if you have any questions or you'd like me to elaborate on things a bit further, we can deal with some of these in the Q&A portion of the webinar a bit later. One thing I like to always do is to put things into context before we zoom into some of the finer details and specifically some of the legislation. And let's zoom out pretty far to look at our beautiful planet Earth right from space, right? Let's not forget that all of us right now are sitting on essentially a spaceship flying through space at a phenomenal speed. The Earth is about 4.54 billion years old. So just try and contextualize how old that is. And Homo sapiens, or humans, have been around for approximately 200,000 of those years. So the Earth has existed for billions upon billions of years without humans. And with that, various other species have existed before humans were here. Plants, fungal species, etc. So I'm not going to read those numbers because I'm not a mathematician, and that's one of the reasons why I studied law. But you can see there's a tremendous amount of space. We have a huge land mass, and we also have a tremendous amount of water. As we know, the Earth is predominantly water. So who lives on our planet Earth? Well, we have about 5 million fungal species, hundreds of thousands of species of plants, and over 7 million species of animals. So these are all estimates, right? We don't actually know the exact numbers of different species, but we know that there are millions of other species that we as human animals share our planet with. But who actually holds rights, and who do we grant legal protection in terms of being legal subjects? Well, only one species, right? So we've just understood that there's millions of different species, but only one of us have rights. And you guessed it, that's us, Homo sapiens, or human animals. So just try and think about that in the context before we launch into some of our discussions. So how many are there of us? Well, quite a lot, right? By 2030, the United Nations predicts that the human population will be at about 8.5 billion. This will increase dramatically in 2050 to approximately 9.8, close to 10 billion. And by the turn of the century, 2100, we'll be at 11.2 billion people, right? That's a hell of a lot of people. If you look at the slide on the screen there, you'll see how dramatically our human population has increased over a very short period of time, right? That illustrates an exponential growth. Granted, it does go back to 10,000 BCE, but you'll see in a very short period of time, humans have increased dramatically, and we're going to increase even further. This is a graph illustrating that spread out over a little bit more years from around the 60s to 2020. You'll see, again, a steady diagonal growth of the human population based on the United Nations and US Census Bureau data. In comparison to that, we see that wildlife populations have almost an exact parallel, but in the opposite direction, plummeted, right, by 2/3 in 50 years. So this scale is from 1970 to around 2020. But you can see a dramatic decline in animal population, specifically wildlife population. This should also be contrasted with the fact that domesticated animal population has increased, particularly for the animals that we farm intensively, right? But it's very clear that we're losing wildlife at an absolutely phenomenal rate in comparison with our human population growth. So against that context, you'll hear me talk about animal throughout the presentation, but it's important to understand what, or rather who we mean by animals, right? It seems like a very basic question, but in fact, it's quite complicated. And specifically when we start to look into the legislation and how we define animals, and then even further past the law into some of our societal norms and perceptions. So most people will agree that cats and dogs, cute as they are on the screen, are animals. Many of us share our homes with companion animals and definitely even consider them as part of our family. And it's indisputable that these are animals. What about elephants? Again, they have a lot of significance culturally and heritage-wise for South Africans and Africans and even Asian people. But is this an animal? Well, according to the law, generally, yes, elephants are classified as animals. What about when we get to something like an ant? Is an ant an animal? Biologically, yes, an ant is an animal, but do we consider them in terms of our animal protection legislation? Can, for example, somebody be charged with cruelty towards an ant in terms of the Animals Protection Act? That's a much broader question and something to start thinking about. So even though the biological reality is that an ant is an animal, many people can kill hundreds of ants in a single day without even a thought about the consequences of that. And even a fish. If you, like me, were grown up told that fish didn't have brain capacities and that they had very short memories, many people don't seem to understand that fish do in fact have these capacities. But do we consider them as animals? Well, in the Animal Welfare Act in America, the definition of animal actually excludes fish and other cold-blooded animals directly from the definition, which means that the protections that are contained in that piece of legislation do not actually apply to fish, despite them being in tremendous numbers, in fact, trillions of animals. So again, important to consider who we consider to be animals. And what about a lamb? Again, do we grant lambs the same sort of legal protections as we grant elephants? And finally, what about a coral, right? Most people wouldn't even think that a coral is an animal, when in fact, biologically, corals are animals. But do we grant protections in terms of the Animals Protection Act and animal protection legislation to corals? And then we get to humans. Again, I already mentioned that humans are animals, but it's an important biological fact that we tend to forget, right? There are some pieces of legislation around the world when they define animal explicitly exclude humans, and that's actually biologically correct unless they want the application of that act or the protections of that act to apply to humans. Okay, so very cute baby. Hopefully you can see that all of these animals are in fact animals biologically, and these are distinguishable from plants and fungi and then other kind of kingdoms that we have in our system. And often you'll hear animal lawyers and others talking about human animals and non-human animals. And the reason is because humans are in fact animals too. But these biological realities need to be contrasted with both the legal realities as well as the societal perceptions and realities, right? So we do classify animals biologically according to kingdoms and phylums, etc. We tend to focus quite a lot on the species. But we as humans also draw our own additional lines, which are not in fact based on biological realities. And these are largely based on our perceptions and our experiences. And we tend to grant those who are higher up in this categorization much better protection. And that includes, for example, mammals as opposed to corals or fish. And even those we share our home with, such as dogs and cats, as opposed to farmed animals. So as you saw the different animals on the slide, I'm sure you realize that you automatically felt a certain way between them. Like when you saw cats and dogs, you felt differently to when you saw an ant. You felt differently when you saw the human animal baby than you did to when you saw the coral. And that comes down to our conditioning, our perceptions, and our bias that we grow up with. And everybody has different ones of these and draws these lines in different ways. And this becomes important when we start to talk about the law. So let's take a step back and think about our history a little bit. Our history has fundamentally shaped the way that our legal systems exist, and particularly the way our laws relate to animals. So we see the concept of animals and our human relationship with animals coming up in, for example, religious texts like the Bible, where they have this concept of dominion. We have people such as Pythagoras, who is most famous for his geometrical feats, but was also one of the first documented vegetarians and had very strong views about animal souls. We see the picture there of the great chain of being, where we see a hierarchical structure of humans being above not only men above women, but also women above animals and animals above plants. So we start to see this hierarchical categorization of where we view animals and plants in our system and how this has subsequently been shaped into law. Descartes is famous for saying that animals are mere machines and they act automatically and that they don't have feelings. And that was a predominant view that carried through many different ages and also into the legal system and led to the reality of them being legal objects. There's also indigenous peoples who had very different views. Obviously, they're all different cultures. They have different belief systems, but generally there's a respect and reverence for nature and for animals. And in Africa, there's also a deep-rooted history of respect for animals and specific species of animals and the significance they hold to different people. For example, viewing them as gifts from God, viewing them as sacred. So all of these things become important, perhaps not immediately, but into how we've let them shape our legal system and our society and our treatment of animals. So what I've just done is cover different species of animals and our belief systems around them. But what if we look at the exact same animal in different contexts, right? On the slide, we see a very cute little bunny rabbit. And in what context might you associate this animal? Most of you might think, and perhaps it's also contextualized to the photo, that this is a pet or a companion animal. So in this case, this is Prince. This is my niece's child, if you will. So he is in fact part of their family. He's a very loved part of their family taken care of. But in another context, Prince could be meat. He could be used for food for both humans and animals. He could be a test subject in a laboratory, subject to very cruel experiments. He could be a pest and be eradicated through invasive species legislation. He could be used for his fur or his skin, for fashionable items, for clothing, for decoration. He could be used in sport. He could be a free-roaming wild animal, and he could even be a therapy animal. So all of these different factors here display how we talk to him in the law. So one is more likely to charge, prosecute, and even successfully prosecute cruelty towards Prince if he's a companion animal, because there's an interest in his protection, a human interest in protecting him. And if you're the owner of him, you might even be entitled to sue a veterinarian for malpractice if there's some sort of damage done to him. You could potentially even leave money to him in your will when you die for his care, and you could set up a trust in his name so that you can ensure that he's taken care of. So already there's seen 3 different consequences: criminal law, civil law, and family law. And then if he's an invasive species, this has an entirely different consequence. He could be eradicated in terms of environmental law, right? And this can be done in extremely cruel ways and almost without justification in many instances. If he was a therapy animal, he might be granted exemptions from body corporate rules or property rules, right? Because in terms of disability law. There's many different other examples that I could give, but I think it's just important to say that Prince, in all of these different situations, he hasn't changed his character, his capacity to suffer. He hasn't changed anything about himself, but the law considers and treats him very differently based on the context in which he finds himself, right? So what matters is we as humans are distinguishing these things, and we are drawing the lines, and then our legal system is acting according to based on those classifications. And we do that with all animals. We categorize them by our use. The ones we share our home with get more protection than the ones that are in factory farms and often suffer tremendously at the hands of the people in control of them, and also compared to wild animals. So all of these become relevant in the context of animal law as to who do we grant protections to and in what contexts, and how far does the law actually go in protecting animals or protecting our own human animal interests. Okay, so how many animals are we using? How many animals are being killed? We don't actually even know, because we don't have accurate nor up-to-date statistical data. We do in certain circumstances, and in others, it's tremendously hard to get this information. It's either underreported, unreported, misreported, or there's no reporting requirements. So that becomes hard as an animal lawyer and people advocating for animals to try and actually push for change when we don't have the data and statistical information that we need. We know that in the farmed animal context, billions of land animals are killed every year, about 31 billion land animals. And again, the estimates, we're not sure for fish, but close to 215 billion potentially. In South Africa, we know at least 1 billion chickens alone are killed for food, and that doesn't even factor in the millions of sheep and goats, and the millions of cows, and the millions of pigs. And as far as I know, we don't actually have statistics for fish either. And fishing is a whole nother can of worms, if you will. As many as possibly 2.3 trillion fish were caught in 2019. It's very hard to contextualize how many animals that is in our own brain, because I can't even think of what a trillion is, never mind 2.3 trillion. And we don't even mention aquatic animals by individuals. When we talk about how many have been caught, we talk about them by the tonnage. And that also shows the value or lack thereof that we actually place on the value of these animals. In terms of pets, in the USA alone, they say 90.5 million families have a pet. In South Africa, again, we don't have proper data, but we do know people spend a lot of money on their pets. In fact, the estimate is about 7.1 billion, right? So people really do care about their animals. They consider them as part of their family, and then compare that with the other animals who are used in different contexts. And the same thing with animal testing. We don't know in the US, the estimates are 110 million. So when you start to add up all these different contexts that we use animals and the numbers in each and every single context, you start to see just how many animals are implicated by our human use. And these are directly used by humans. It doesn't factor in the ones that are indirectly affected by things like climate change and other human or anthropocentric activities. One final classification I want to just draw attention to is that other than the usage, we also talk about animals in different contexts, and that dictates their legal protection. So if an animal is endangered, threatened, or vulnerable, for example, or otherwise protected, they are then granted certain categories of protection in law, or there's other requirements one needs to do in order to interact with these animals. So one might need a permit to kill or hunt them, or something else from the government in some sort of way. I've already mentioned invasive species, but if an animal is damage causing, they can generally be killed quite quickly without, any sort of consequences, subject to a few requirements. One other example I just want to pull out from there is this charismatic megafauna. That's a term that we use for animals that we really consider charismatic and have value to us. So elephants, rhinos, lions, leopards, buffaloes, the big five in South Africa. Those are charismatic, even whales and dolphins, right? But we give much less attention to, for example, salmon or fish. So I'm going to just have you sink some of that in because I've spoken quite a lot about these different categories, but start to think also in your own life how you treat other animals differently, how you perceive other animals differently, and why you do it, and start to kind of break down and question some of those cognitive biases. So what is animal law? Okay, it's not such an easy question. I'm going to try my best to do this topic justice. On the slide, you see a woman and a horse. Right? One of them is a person and one of them is a thing. And I'm talking legally. One of them is a legal person. One of them is a legal thing. That is a reality in our legal system. Okay? On the slide, we have another example of two legal things. We have a cute kitten and we have an iPhone. You can see that these things are clearly distinguishable from one another, but yet our law considers them both to be legal things. Is that an issue? I argue, yes, it is. A cat is very different to an iPhone. Granted, you can do certain things with an iPhone that you can't do to a cat, but the fundamental status that underlies these two individuals, if you will, is that they are both considered as property. Legally, animals are property. This has flown from our Roman Dutch heritage. This continues to exist today. They are all deemed to be owned. They're not self-owning. But importantly, this ownership does not necessarily require responsible care. Yes, there's animal cruelty legislation and there's certain things and actions and omissions that you can't do in relation to an animal. But by and large, there's no real duty of care to take care of these animals, right? Especially in the way that they need and deserve. Animals lack legal standing. And what that means is they can't necessarily come or have somebody come and approach them in front of a court in a very easy way, right? It's very difficult to argue for legal standing. You have to show other things, for example, that it's in the public interest. You really have to show a number of factors, and that is a big barrier to advocating for them in the legal system. So as a result, they have little to no protection, and the assumption is that use and exploitation is essentially the norm. We as human animals, we as the legal subjects of the world can really do what we want. Animals are plentiful, renewable resource. They're designed to be used somehow, and they're valuable to us. And that's why they're valuable, is because humans have placed a value on them. And then we dictate the value based on whatever it is that we decide. And this approach has really led us to neglect, cruelty, extinction, and even human abuses. I'm going to touch on how this impacts us as humans too. So this legal person, legal subject divide, as I mentioned, is that only humans are the holders of rights. This is also to be contrasted with the fact that companies, corporations, and other associations are also, in fact, the holders of rights. So it's not only humans. We consider companies to be legal subjects, but we don't consider animals to be legal subjects. They are legal objects. Okay, as I mentioned, there are some rules between legal objects, right? There's cruelty legislation, there's environmental protection legislation. It's not that there's no limitation about what we can do to animals, but this fundamental legal status will always dictate how we treat them until it's reversed or changed, right? So in terms of animal law, what do we do? Well, there's no universal definition. One can look at a broad or a narrow interpretation. The broad one is simply anywhere where an animal or an animal interest is involved or implicated. And I'll give an example in a second. And the other one is where a narrow one, where the interests of the animal themselves is considered, right? We're not only looking at human interests, excuse me, we're looking also at the animal interest. That's more kind of animal-centric and advocacy-based. Importantly, though, there is a distinguishment. You can be advocacy-based who advocates for welfare, animal welfare, or you can advocate for animal rights. Not all animal lawyers do the same thing. Whereas human rights lawyers tend to always agree that human rights are important, although they might not agree on which set of rights. A comparable example is environmental lawyers, where some environmental lawyers work towards protecting the environment, and other environmental lawyers work within regulating the environment, for example, which might allow destruction of the environment, provided there's compliance with getting a permit and the other environmental legislation that applies. So practically these two broad and narrow examples, if somebody buys a racehorse, Cape Town gets it shipped to Durban, the horse is injured during shipping. On a narrow definition, that impacts the animal and his interests, in which case this is definitely an animal law case. In the same situation, there's a shipment also of the horse, but there's some sort of delay, which means the horse arrives late. That by and large, and there's no, let's assume there's no harm to the horse. That by and large is a contractual law matter, right? But if you argue it on a very broad interpretation, you could still say this is animal law because that animal is involved and there is potentially some sort of implication on the animal's interest. So that's just to give an idea of a practical example. One of the definitions I think is quite encompassing is that it includes all facets of law and policy, from the legislative, judicial, and executive that relate to, consider, or interact with non-human animals and human animals themselves. Okay, so that's what I like to do. I think it runs throughout the entirety of law, policy, litigation, legal services, and even education and research. I mentioned very briefly that there is some differentiation between the views of animal lawyers and even animal advocates. So some follow an animal welfare approach, which is essentially that humans can use animals. Our interests will always supersede animals, but that animals should be treated with just a minimal amount of care or should not be suffering, at least unnecessarily, right? So we can do things to them, but we need to give them some sort of consideration. And this is the predominant view that we see in much of our legislation. It's contained in things like the 5 freedoms and more recently things like the 5 domains. Animal well-being is less written about, although it is a kind of burgeoning thought that's happening. It's now contained in NEMLA, the NEMLA amendment, which I'll touch on in a moment, and includes both physical and mental aspects. So it's somewhat broader in a sense. Animal welfare is also largely science-based. It can be objective, and animal well-being can also be a bit more subjective. So the distinguishment is not quite clear, but there are 2 different concepts which operate in this context. Animal rights thinks or looks at the fundamental status of animals as being property and challenges that and says animals shouldn't just be property, animals should have the capacity to have rights, and to the extent that these rights conflict with human interests, these need to be adjudicated on and weighed up. And this is similar and comparable to the fact that all humans are supposed to have rights, and our rights conflict all the time. But a court and other bodies are meant to adjudicate when these things do, and that ensures some sort of fair process. But essentially what it does is it gives animals a seat at the table at least, and doesn't just assume that their interests are always superseded by human interests. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the concept of animal rights. However, fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that their property status should be challenged. And then animal protection is a very broad term, which encompasses all different aspects of these 3 concepts that I've just touched on. And it's one that most people feel familiar and comfortable using because it can mean different things. Briefly, animal law intersects with so many other areas of law generally, everything from environmental law. The intersections are quite obvious with environmental law to something like tax law. So if you consider something like a meat tax, which would add a premium to the cost of products of animals' bodies, that also is animal law because it can ultimately potentially lead to greater protections for them. So I won't go through all of these. We can deal with some of them in the chat, but it's important to see that it does intersect and interact with all these different other areas of law. I'll touch a couple on these today. And outside of the legal realm, it also intersects with various other specialist areas, from philosophy to science to food and even communications and media, right? And of course, empirical research. So again, read through these in your discretion, but it really is an exciting and very kind of holistic and integrative way to look at the law, because it does encompass all of these different areas too. And we in fact get to engage with specialists across these realms in our work. So why is animal law important? Well, first and foremost is that animals are important and animals matter. They are sentient beings. Right? This is a science-based test. It's been confirmed in peer-reviewed scientific journals across the world for many years. It's been confirmed in legislation throughout the world, right? Those are a couple of the jurisdictions. I haven't put all of them, but the increasing number are doing it. The UK Sentience Act is in the works, and it also recognizes the sentience of cephalopod, so octopuses essentially, and decapod crustaceans, so crabs. So that's a new advancement, but sentience is now well confirmed Our own Constitutional Court has confirmed this, both in a 2016 judgment as well as in a minority judgment from 2008 of Justice Cameron, and has also been confirmed in the norms and standards relating to elephants. They have capacities. Again, this has been confirmed by the Constitutional Court. They can suffer. We recognize this in our own legislation in the Animals Protection Act. We also have scientific peer-reviewed studies that show that they can suffer. This is not a controversial topic, right? Outside of suffering, they have various other capacities, from cooperation to using tools to maternal instincts to deception to patience. There really is no end to show that these animals, in fact, have an increasing number of capacities. And while we previously thought that they were limited, we're seeing increasingly so that they are not. And also just important to note that we are using these human-based tests to assess them, which isn't in fact accurate because they are unique in their own right. But again, it's a very anthropocentric approach to determining capacities, and even using that approach, animals are passing them consistently. An important development was recognized by the top scientists of the world, including Stephen Hawking and others, in the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness of 2012, where they were really trying to pin down what consciousness was, right, as distinguishable from sentience. But in this, they actually say that the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in this regard. And in fact, many non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, as well as many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these capacities. This is a very important advancement. If animals have these capacities, they're able to suffer and they're conscious. How should we include this in our legal system? Should we be mandated to include this in our legal system? Another important fact is that animals have intrinsic worth and value. Again, this has been confirmed by our Constitutional Court. This is not my perspective. This is something we've seen actually come through from our Constitutional Court statements. And this is as individuals as well as at a species level. And of course, they are in peril, right? They are being killed at a dramatic rate, right? Not all of them, some are being farmed and then killed, but many of the wild animals are being completely demolished. Many scientists agree we're in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, and some have referred to it as a biological annihilation, right? This is not a good thing. They need our help, right? This is why it's so important. They are members of our society. They are vulnerable members of our society, and they are worthy of our consideration and our protection. If we take a moment to reflect on the South African Constitution, our preamble, right, of 1996, a few key points is that we believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. So think about everyone who lives in South Africa, and think about not just human animals, but perhaps everyone else we share our beautiful country with. And that we are trying to establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And I'm going to talk about how those are implicated too by use of animals. And that every citizen is equally protected by the law. And then again, the quality of life of all citizens. So keep that word citizens in mind as I move to the next point. Thabo Mbeki, when he was announcing the Constitution, made some very sweeping statements in his I Am an African speech, right? He says, at times and in fear, I have wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion and the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito. A human presence amongst all of these, a feature on the face of our native land thus defined. I know that none dare challenge me when I say I am an African. So Thabo Mbeki here is really saying, considering, is it just humans that should be considered as citizens of our country? Do these animals not matter in the context of citizenship? Do they not provide value to us? Do they not have value themselves? He's really providing an ethos of care and asking us to question who we consider as citizens. And there's been actually some very recent scholarship about this in a book called Zoopolis of Animals as Citizens, which I encourage you to read if you're interested in the citizenship aspect. The second reason why it's important to protect animals, or why animal law is important, is for the environment. I'm not going to expand too much on this because I think this has been really well established and documented, and I think this is less controversial because we know that animals play a critical role in our nature, in our environment. They perform essential and critical functions for us, not limited to pollination, fertilization, balancing ecosystems, etc. The jellyfish is but one example. And without animals, our planet would die. So I think that is less controversial. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I will talk about the intersections in a moment. Clearly, we're not doing very good or well at recognizing the value that animals add to our environment if we look at the serious decline, just for example, within our oceanic and aquatic systems, right? It's very clear that things are dire. And finally, I've put this one last, is that animal law is important because of human animals, right? The traditional narrative is that animals are important because of the value they bring to us. I'm flipping that out, right? They are important because they bring value to us, but that is not the sole and first and foremost reason, right? What I will do is look at it from a purely anthropocentric perspective for this slide, is that we do need animals. Their interests are fundamentally and inextricably linked with ours. We rely on them for so many things, and that's everything from companionship to food and medicine. And their survival impacts our survival, as I just said, right? They hold and sustain and stabilize the environment. Without them, we would not have an environment and we would perish, right? One thing I do want to highlight a little bit is more of how protecting animals is in fact a social justice issue, because I think this narrative really needs to be understood and is so important in South Africa when we talk about animal protection, because in many ways people say and have said to me, why do you focus on animal law when there's so much human suffering, and why do you not do human rights? So firstly, I do human rights, and I believe that protecting animals fundamentally protects human rights too. And I'm hopefully going to illustrate a couple of examples to you of how animal protection is in fact a social justice issue. And I'm going to use the Constitution as a basis to show this. And that's just a very nice quote from Chief Seattle, which talks about humans being part of the web of life, right? And how we're only one part of it. And I think this is important when we consider the issues of social justice, is that we are just part of an entire web, right? And what we do to the web impacts us as humans. So what does social justice do? We look at protecting vulnerable members of our society. It looks at dealing with issues of inequality, inequity, power, oppression, things that are unfair or unjust, the exploitation of certain groups, victimization and protecting victims, unequal government regulation, access, and various other aspects. But generally, these are things that are similar throughout social justice movements if we look at them. Some very high-level examples of how our use of animals and exploitation of animals impacts social justice is that it impacts human health and public health. We saw this from the zoonotic disease outbreak of listeriosis in 2017, where people died, and the most vulnerable members of our society were the ones who died. We see this in wildlife trafficking and its threat to national security and our international reputation, how the intersection of criminal activities affects communities and the criminal justice system. We see this in gender issues, the sexualization and advertising of animal products, as well as violence. I'll give it a specific example of that. We see it in racial considerations, including who owns the most animals, who owns the land, who uses them, who benefits the most from them, who the workers are, which leads to issues around labor and worker rights and their safety and their protection, or rather lack thereof. The environmental ones, again, I'll touch a little bit on these. And then, of course, things like property rights, and who we know that animals are property, so who benefits the most from them, who stands to lose the most from the current system being overturned. And then at a consumer protection level, things like humane washing, greenwashing, and actively misleading consumers. These are just a few. There's plenty that I could highlight, but hopefully you start to see how these fit into the realm of animal law and social justice and human rights protection. So looking at the Bill of Rights, Section 12 talks about freedom and security of the person. The one clause I want to highlight is that everyone has the right to be free from all forms of violence, either in the public or private sources. There is very well documented evidence that there is a tremendous link between cruelty towards animals and cruelty towards humans. And this is actually called the link. And that picture there you'll see is from the National Coalition link, if you're interested in getting some more information about it. Considering South Africa has one of the highest rates of rape and femicide in the entire world, and we've witnessed really brutal killings and rape and horrible things happening towards women, we really need to start thinking about some of these issues holistically, right, and how they impact various members of our society. President Cyril Ramaphosa said himself that this is a second type of pandemic, which he said during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it manifests itself in various ways in our society. Dr. Sheena Swema has just released PhD research supervised by Professor Bulchitz on this. We had a webinar last week about it. I encourage you to check it out. Very interesting work that's being done, and very important work to highlight how we can better protect the rights and needs of humans, particularly women and children and other vulnerable members, by protecting animals and including them in domestic violence legislation. So very important work happening there. Another example relates to slaughterhouse workers and how killing sentient animals day in and day out, in fact, not only implements them psychologically through things like post-traumatic stress disorder, but also leads and flows into their homes immediately, committing violence within their own homes and then even within their communities. And this is a very good article from Victor K. Barnard about slaughtering for a living, where they actually interviewed slaughterhouse workers and got some statements about how they were so desensitized from killing animals that they wouldn't even have a second thought to go out and kill a person, which is very disturbing, obviously. And I think a lot more research and consideration needs to be done for these workers who are being subjected to do this really horrible work, and how this impacts on their communities, and then, of course, how it impacts on the animals. So we start to see these intersections very clearly, and we definitely need more research on this. A lot of work is being done in America and other countries, but we need more in South Africa too. The next right I want to look at is section 27, which talks about the right to food and water, right? Everybody has the right to sufficient food and water, and the government needs to take reasonable legislative and other steps to achieve this right, the progressive realization of this right. The increase in meat is happening quite tremendously, right? It's not something that's being decreased. People are eating more and more meat, right? Which means more and more animals are being killed for food. Compare this to the fact that we have massive food insecurity in the country, right? The prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity is around 44%, which is 45% actually in South Africa between 2018 and 2020. So it's very clear that we have a massive problem when it comes to food security. The questions we need to start asking is eating animals and is eating animal products the best way to pursue or achieve food security, food justice, and food sovereignty? So I would say no, right? Especially when we consider it in the context of other rights. How much water are we using to produce this food? How much resources are we using to produce this food? How much land? All these different things factored in. So looking at other environmental rights. On the slide, you'll see a diagram of the amount of water used in the production of different animal products, and of course vegetable products too, including nuts is very high. But look at bovine meat, goat meat, pig meat, chicken meat, right? These are tremendous amounts of water for a country that is in drought and has a water scarcity. So we need to start thinking about these things much more carefully, specifically in the light of these constitutional guarantees that each South African is given. Moving on to the next right I want to look at is the right to environment in section 24. A lot of you will be familiar with it. It's a beautiful right. It's got amazing sentiments in it. It covers a tremendous amount of things. What I want to do, though, is compare this right line by some of the practices we see happening for animals. And there may be one or two pictures in here that may be disturbing to people. I'll try and remind you as I get to that slide, but I do apologize in advance as a trigger warning. So if we look at this to an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being, considering the impact that the industrialized farming of animals has on the environment, including air pollution and the massive amount of air pollution in South Africa, are we achieving this right? Also to acknowledge that it's not only humans who are impacted by harmful environments, but animals are also impacted by harmful environments. Right, for the benefit of future and present generations, I've already spoken about the massive decline in our wildlife and the risk of extinction of a huge number of species and the sixth mass extinction and biological annihilation. Right, how well are we doing for our future generations, not only of people, but of animals too? This reasonable and legislative and other measures is an important one because it places an obligation on the government to actually implement laws and policies for the progressive realization of these rights. Arguably, if you look at some of the policies that government's releasing, which I'm going to highlight briefly towards the end, I would say that this is not necessarily aligned to the constitutional right, specifically this provision, right? Because it does, in fact, these are not reasonable legislative measures if we look at the right in its totality. And there's a couple of other pieces on the slide. So I think the next slide might be the one with the pictures. Oh no, sorry, it might be the next one. Anyway, so the other one is also about pollution and how it impacts animals. You can see on the slide the massive impact on animals, not just human animals, non-human animals too, of pollution. And this idea of conservation, right? So in South Africa, promoting conservation for many years has been around hunting, trophy hunting, the farming of wild animals, including lions, alligators, crocodiles, all these different kinds of animals that we farm, and we see this in the name of conservation. This is very problematic, and it has been challenged in terms of court cases, which I'll touch on in a moment. But is this truly conservation in alignment with our constitution and our constitutional values? And then the sustainable use of resources, right? Are we actually living up to this promise in our constitution through the dramatic use and capturing, for example, through large-scale industrialized fisheries? I would say not. And then again, we see this justifiable economic and social development. So are these policies by government, or are these industry actions in fact justifiable in terms of the context of the rest of the constitutional right and the other constitutional rights that I've mentioned? We need to consider that transformative constitution is an important concept within our constitution, that it wasn't designed just to preserve the existing status quo, but we are really trying to fundamentally transform our society, right, against this background of apartheid and severe and abhorrent racial inequality that was experienced during that time and still exists today, as South Africa is the most unequal country in the entire world. We really need to look at our constitution and what it's trying to achieve and compare and challenge some of these practices that are happening against this constitutional background and transformative constitutionalism, right? So this is being done slowly but surely in the courts. I'm going to highlight a couple examples. One of the most significant cases is from 2016. Very briefly, it came out of a religious sacrificial ceremony where camels were being slaughtered, and there were many attempts to kill the animals. And there was an NSPCA inspector there, and then eventually, after watching this for a number of time, ended up just killing the animals, shooting them to put them out of their misery. And they wanted to prosecute in terms of this, but the National Prosecuting Authority refused to do this. But then the NSPCA really wanted to follow this up with a prosecution. This is what led to the ultimate court case. This is not actually dealt with too much in the case itself, but what is important about this case is that the court really took this opportunity to advance the law and make a number of far-reaching statements, which have actually fundamentally shifted the position relating to animals in our South African legal system. I won't talk about all of the details, but they refer to the Openshaw case, so they recognize the sentience of animals. Now, remember, this is a constitutional court case. It's the highest court in South Africa. They've said specifically that constitutional values dictate a more caring attitude towards fellow humans, animals, and the environment in general. Okay, and this was particularly important because of South African history. In this groundbreaking statement, the court also acknowledged that while previously we might have protected animals because of our own moral considerations and how it impacted on humans, this has changed to shifting and placing intrinsic value on animals as individuals. Now, this recognition of intrinsic value is tremendous and very significant and really illustrates an evolution, right? Because if we place intrinsic value on animals as individuals, not even just at a species level, then we have to consider their well-being and their interests. And we have to do it in light of the Constitution, specifically Section 24, because the court linked this to Section 24, to having the right to environment protected. In fact, they linked conservation to animal welfare, right? And then they made a number of other positive statements. I encourage you to check out the case if you haven't yet, but it really is of great importance. It also indicates a shift in environmental law where we traditionally look at protecting species to looking at individual animals. And Professor David Bulchitz has done some work on an integrative versus an aggregative approach, and I can drop the link to that journal if you're interested. But essentially, again, this is a fundamental shift if we look at things like the captive lion industry, right? You may or may not know about it. If you don't, I encourage you to check out Blood Lions. There's a documentary, there's a website with a lot of information, but it really is one of the most abhorrent industries where they take babies, they use them throughout the entirety of their lives in this endless cycle of feeding them, interacting with tourists, voluntourism, ultimately killing them in trophy hunts, and then exporting their bones. And this case that I want to talk about actually incorporated the former constitutional case that I just discussed, the 2016 one, in relation to the lion bone quota. Now, South Africa is a member of the CITES, which is the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And in terms of CITES, we were granted an annotation to be allowed to export lion skeletons, right? So what the government does is they set quotas. In 2017, they set a quota for 800 skeletons, so ultimately 800 lions. And then in 2018, this jumped up to nearly double of 1,500. This was challenged, this decision, by the NSPCA, right? It was an administrative decision by the DFFE, and they challenged it because on many grounds, but they said that ultimately the department had not taken into account animal welfare. And if you look at that 2016 judgment, they absolutely had to. So that was the basis of this. And the court actually agreed. NSPCA won, and they said that the decision to export that number of lion bone skeletons was unconstitutional and invalid because it is inconceivable that the state respondents could have ignored welfare considerations of lions in captivity in setting the annual export quota. So this was a high court judgment, but it did incorporate the NSPCA 2016 judgment and also re-emphasize and confirm that government has a responsibility to take into account welfare when making decisions around animals. I don't think I'm going to have time to go into two of these cases that are very new and exciting because they relate to the application of different human rights, conflicting human rights, but both of them involve animals and both of them were successful in the sense that the court limited human rights, including to privacy, where there was like a public interest involved in getting information from the state or documenting information in the one case on social media of abuse and dead animals. So if you're interested, I can go back to that in the Q&A, but there are some very promising developments also happening in the realm of human rights in relation to animals. So I quickly want to talk through the framework. I've spoken a lot about the constitutional one, but really our statutory framework as it pertains to animals is not holistic, right? It's very fragmented. It's contained at different levels from national government to provincial government. It's spread across different government departments. The Department of Agriculture is predominantly responsible, but then the DFFE, the Department of Environment, is also responsible for aspects of wild animals. And that means I've categorized it really into three main areas. The one is animal law, which is animal protection or welfare centered, environmental law, which is environmental centric. And then there's the regulation of other issues that impact on our use, which is human-centric, arguably. All of them are human-centric, but they relate to things like consumer protection and food safety and health, etc. So I'm going to look quickly at the animal legislation. Most people are aware that the Animals Protection Act is the main piece of legislation. It's been in place for 60 years, which is a very long time. It widely defines animal, although there's some discussion as to whether free-roaming wild animals and aquatic species such as fish are included. It's a criminal statute, which means it's limited by criminal law. You have to have a very high onus rate to get a crime. The penalties are not really high. There is a long list of different offenses, but those are usually qualified by things such as the wording of unnecessary suffering, which is very confusing. And also things like cruelly beating. Again, it's unclear how one could not cruelly beat an animal. So it does have some very positive elements in some ways, right? But it has a lot of flaws. The one specific ban in the piece of legislation was from an amendment, the Animal Matters Amendment Act, where it bans animal fighting, but animal fighting, including dog fighting, is still a major issue in South Africa. The minister is empowered to make regulations. So importantly, it was transferred from the Department of Justice to the Department of Agriculture in 1997. But since then, the ministers have not promulgated proper regulations. There were two done previously under the Department of Justice, but there's been no regulations passed since then. And the Act does not set specific welfare standards. So that's a huge flaw, right? They only set out crimes and negative obligations, which are unclear, as I've mentioned. But because of this, there's been a proliferation of soft law and standards, including industry standards, where they set the standards themselves, and these are unenforceable, or they're voluntary, or they deal with a whole other plethora of issues that because they're not, in fact, legislation and enforceable. So by and large, this framework fails to protect the interests of animals and also fails to recognize the complexities of their needs and capacities. It is, of course, 60 years old. A lot has changed since then in our understanding of the world and of animals and in our society more generally. We've increased the use of animals dramatically. We have things like factory farming now, which we didn't. We have an environmental crisis, which we didn't necessarily have then. We have new technologies, right? We have lab-grown meat. We have things like plant-based alternatives. We have alternatives to animal testing based on technology. Where are these things in terms of featuring in the Act, right? And then it also doesn't look at the framework holistically as it interacts with, for example, environmental legislation. As I mentioned, they're under two different departments. The Department of Environment has largely said that they don't have mandate for welfare. So they don't have specific bans on practices like sow stalls, live exports, animals in circuses. Many other countries have passed these in their legislation at a national level and at a local level. South Africa has banned very few practices in our law. I already spoke a little bit about it being a criminal statute and some of the limitations of that. So what I want to look a little bit is that it still essentially fundamentally doesn't challenge the status quo, and it doesn't challenge institutionalized cruelty. So for example, animals in factory farm settings. Arguably, it could be unconstitutional based on the developments of the NSPCA case because it doesn't take into account this intrinsic value, the sentience of animals, etc. We can see this by the use of the wording destroy, destruction. These are very anthropocentric and problematic terms. Looking at the enforcement, it's a major issue. Obviously, I mentioned already that it's under the Department of Agriculture. They have an incentive and a mandate to promote the use of animals, to promote animal farming, to increase agriculture. Are they the right governmental department to be in charge of animal welfare? The NSPCA largely enforces it. They are a non-profit that receives no funding from the government. They only receive public funding. So that's hugely problematic in terms of not having enough resources and being overburdened. There's problems within the structure. Professor David Bulchis has done some research around structuring a public entity that protects animals and whether that is aligned to the NSPCA's current structure. And then there's also some practical issues as an animal organization working within them. Obviously, they're doing their best. They're doing tremendous work, but we need to consider them as the public body that's been allocated animal welfare and whether they have the resources that they need to effectively fulfill their mandate. In terms of prosecutions, as I mentioned, it's a criminal legislation. These are very negligible, right? These are minimal. If we look at the amount of cruelty that's happening on a daily basis, excluding institutionalized cruelty just against individual animals, these are very, very tiny prosecutions. I don't admit that it's extremely hard to get successful prosecutions. Just think about how much is happening and the actual successful prosecution rate, okay? You would have seen the Thandi Modise case. That was, the NSPCA said, one of the most horrific instances of animal cruelty they'd ever seen, and that didn't end in a successful prosecution. So how successful are we in implementing this Animals Protection Act? There is right now a bill to amend the Act to include a ban of cosmetic testing on animals. We'll see if it passes. If it does, it will be another ban that's added to this piece of legislation. It fell through already previously, but it's been initiated by a private member's bill and creates a new offense. So let's see how that goes. A lot of countries have already banned the practice, and hopefully South Africa will follow soon. And then very briefly, we also have the Performing Animals Protection Act, which despite its name is really a licensing statute. It's nearly 90 years old. Again, a lot has changed since then. It has exemptions and exceptions for zoos and other facilities. And although it was amended quite recently and it did include a few welfare provisions, it still by and large does not account for performing animals and protecting them, including that we allow wild animals in circuses and the plethora of wildlife interactive activities that we offer in South Africa. And it is also important to note that there is going to be a new animal welfare bill. We have no idea when. The government says they're working on it. It is under the Department of Agriculture. It's predominantly composed of Department of Agriculture representatives. They haven't involved animal protection organizations at this stage. So it really is unclear what it'll look like. We can provide input into it once it's released, but we'll have to see what comes out of it. The idea is that it will replace the Animals Protection Act and the Performing Animals Protection Act. So stay tuned to that. Some recent developments by DALARD in charge of animal welfare have been deeply concerning in terms of the Master Poultry Plan, which aims to increase the production of poultry tremendously and make South Africa a leader in exporting this. They're looking at live export guidelines, which are guidelines and not regulations, and they intend to regulate a very harmful industry. As we know, we've seen other countries ban it, but the government is now seeking to regulate it through guidelines, which are not even regulations. They are guidelines. And then quite recently, you might have seen in the news, the attack on the veggie burger, where the DALARD issued a communique that certain vegan vegetarian products couldn't use terms that were reserved for processed meat products, right? This is against the context of the massive amount of harm that we know for sure comes from industrialized terrestrial animal agriculture. So these are just a couple of examples. I have pulled some of these already, discussed them, so I'm not going to go into detail. But against this context of very, very harmful environmental as well as human practices, government is looking at expanding these operations. So arguably this comes out again with the right to food and water as to whether this is a reasonable legislative initiative based on the harms and weighing up against these harms. Okay, so you'll just quickly see the Master Poultry Plan is also with the Department of Trade and Industry, driving exports, driving demand, driving this industry. I encourage you to look at the document yourself, and the live export guidelines are still about to be released again after a consultation process. And again, this meat analog action, the reason why it falls within the definition of animal law is because if people do not have alternatives to eating animals, which we know is of course very harmful to them, then there's really nowhere to go, right? These alternatives are a critical part of animal law. So things like cell-based meat, plant-based products, fungi-based products, these are ways that people who decide to not eat animals are able to still find food and nutrition. And if there isn't proper regulation of them, or if there's things like this meat analog action that the government has released without providing alternatives, and they're starting to seize products, for example, it becomes very hard to provide an alternative structure for other people. Okay, so very quickly in terms of environmental regulation, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but really this is centered around the environmental right, which I've gone through. It falls under the DFFE. They previously said they didn't have a mandate to deal with these issues, but I've discussed the Lion Bone case and the NEMLA Act. And I'm going to discuss very quickly some of the recent developments there. The framework is largely based on NEMA. There's some biodiversity legislation called NEMBA. There's regulations for threatened or protected species, which allow for restricted activities of these species that are protected, provided you have the right permit, you pay the right price, for example. That's how we see things like trophy hunting being allowed. Then there's norms and standards, which is actually a very progressive document from 2008 because it explicitly recognizes the sentience of animals, which is the only explicit recognition of sentience in South African law. Recently, the government has undertaken a number of different initiatives which fall on the spectrum of being positive, the potential to be positive, or approach with caution. NEMLA, as I mentioned, includes a definition of well-being, which is important because previously the department denied the mandate to regulate animal welfare and well-being. So this provides them with this legislative mandate, and it is quite broadly defined, as you can see on the slide. They also initiated a high-level panel process where they put together an expert panel, the minister did, to look at issues of rhinos, lions, leopards, and elephants. After various consultations in 2 years, they came out with a report. And since then, they've implemented a couple of strategies around there, a wildlife welfare forum with the animal protection industries, and then also, sector, and then also an MOU. They've recently released a draft white paper, which also has the potential for some very positive developments, including the inclusion of intrinsic worth, living in harmony with nature, and the thriving of people and nature. But it needs to be contrasted with some of the other provisions in the draft document, which are arguably in contravention of that, such as people first. I'm going to also just say that it's probably, if you're looking at the white paper and this recognition of intrinsic value, it could be seen to be in conflict with some of these other policies that the government's released, including the game meat strategy and the aquaculture development bill, which are also about increasing the production of animals, increasing the farming of animals. And with that also comes the potential to increase the use of other animals, such as insects, in their food, right? So I'm not sure I see Angela on screen. I've got probably about 5 minutes. Is that fine? Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, so I'll briefly just talk about what animal lawyers do. So we work across the realm. All of these pieces of legislation that I've just mentioned to you, we provide submissions to the government on. We make sure that animals have a seat at the table, that there's somebody speaking out for their well-being, particularly in law and policy. So we do this through submissions and research. We're undertaking a couple of projects now through animal law reform. We just launched our first case for the 3 elephants at the Johannesburg Zoo, together with the EMS Foundation and Chief Fritz, who's a member of the Khoisan. And I won't go into all of those. We also taught the first animal law course earlier this year, which was very exciting, considering there's animal law courses now around the world, including about 167 in the US and Canada and in New Zealand. I won't talk about our work. There's quite a lot of examples of exact submissions we've made on our website, but we do get to work with stakeholders across the sector. It really is amazing. And I think it's important that we start to look at these intersections and how we can build on and work with human rights lawyers, environmental lawyers, and animal lawyers to get some of the successes, including some of the ones we've seen recently with the Shell case. So great. I think with that, there's a lot of positive work being done in this area. Obviously, there's a lot of negative things we're trying to fight against and make sure interests are protected. But I would say by and large, animal law is firmly being established as a separate field of law. And also looking at interspecies and intergenerational justice. I want to end with a quote from the 2016 NSPCA case, where Justice Kampepe said, "From the ancient Khoisan, our perception of animals has changed and shifted from being mere brutes and beasts to being fellow beasts, and finally to companions, friends, and brothers." So with that, I'm going to close and say thank you and welcome your questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was really an insightful and detailed presentation. I, for one, am really excited to see the development of animal law and it moving towards being its own branch of law. And I've been following this in the international context, and I'm excited to see that South Africa is becoming more active, at least, in promoting legislation and developing policy that is moving towards a stronger recognition of animal welfare and sentience and so on. I have a few questions, but I'm going to give the audience preference. I see there are 3. I'm going to read the first question to you and then you can respond, and then we'll take it from there. Right, so the first question is from Celine. She refers to the Blood Lions documentary and saying that the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment stated that the welfare of the lions was not their concern, as they are concerned with matters threatening biodiversity and conservation. They passed the buck, stating that the Department of Agriculture and Land Reform was the department concerned with the welfare of lions. Given that conservation and individual animal welfare is intertwined, is there any way in ensuring that these departments, including others, meaningfully engage with each other to ensure fulfillment of conservation of biodiversity and animal welfare?
Great. So thanks so much, Celine. There's a lot in there to break down, so I'll try my best. I think absolutely one thing we saw from the Lion Bone judgment was that the court rejected the statement that the DFFE did not have a mandate to deal with animal welfare, particularly in light of that constitutional court judgment. So the court, actually, the judgment deals specifically with them saying that they didn't have the mandate. as I mentioned, I think now with the promulgation of NEMLA, there's really no denying that there's at least a legislative mandate now to deal with well-being. And another development from that high-level panel that I mentioned briefly was that the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environment have now entered into an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, which is meant to deal with some of these issues about the regulation of wild animals and welfare, etc. So I think absolutely they need to be challenged on that. It's something we've mentioned to them. We've said there's this constitutional court judgment, there's a high court judgment. We consistently bring that into our submissions. So I think absolutely, I think with the MOU, we'll have to see how it ends up being promulgated, but it's definitely a point that needs to be challenged with the department.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to then combine. So there's an interesting comment from Anonymous saying that, or not from Anonymous, from Natrisha, saying that in India, there's the concept of reincarnation. And wouldn't animal rights or animal welfare be taken more seriously if we think about the concept of reincarnation, saying that a soul moves into bodies of animals depending on the karma incurred? So this person is saying that if your favorite aunt has passed on, they could be a feral cat. And if we do that, if we think of it that way, would humans not take it more seriously? And then there is another question that speaks about, are there laws that govern ethical clearances for animal research equally applied to other economic activities? For example, the lion skeleton exports, is that subject to the same ethical considerations that animal research is subject to, similar to animal farming and slaughter? So I don't know if you want to first address that. There are a few more questions too.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll try my best. So the first question about the reincarnation. So I definitely can't speak to the cultural religious aspects of that. But what I will say is that if there is some sort of significance, these rights to culture and religion, etc., are protected in the South African Constitution. And there are jurisdictions such as in India where they have taken these concepts and used them to provide for greater protection for animals in their constitution. For example, Ahimsa and others. Again, I'm not an expert, but I know that there are ways to take cultural and religious beliefs and use them as arguments to potentially justify better protection for animals. So I think definitely there are opportunities there. In South African context, I'm not 100% sure. I'm not sure that it's been done before, but I wouldn't say that it's impossible if you look at the Constitution. So I hope that answers it. It's quite a difficult question. So the second one was about ethical clearance for animal research. So in terms of ethical clearances, there's not actually proper laws that govern this. Oh, it's disappeared. There's actually, this is usually governed by an animal ethics committee, which is composed of certain experts. So I wouldn't even say it's a legal clearance that's given. There's various problems with that methodology of having the animal ethics committee being in charge of that. In terms of the permitting, no, they don't look at ethical considerations, right? When the government is issuing permits, they definitely don't consider whether it's an ethical decision to do so, for example, to grant a trophy hunting permit or a lion bone permit. I would argue that it is something we should consider, although they should at least consider the welfare and well-being now, considering the NEMLA, amendment. So maybe not on ethical grounds, but on welfare grounds. But an argument could be made they should consider that sort of thing based on our constitution.
Thank you. I mean, there's an interesting question, and that is, can you talk about the intersection between animal law and estate planning for the drafting of wills?
Yeah,
and
sure.
Then, sorry, just another one. Do you argue for progressive realization of animal rights or outright protection? To my mind, that's quite interesting if we think about the recent deadly air case where the court said section 24 is calls for immediate realization, but I'll leave that to you to answer.
No, definitely. That's great. Okay, I'll deal with the first one first. So in terms of animal law and estate planning or drafting wills, I will say this is actually, there's people in the US that specifically practice in this area of law for people when they are putting together their wills. They approach an animal lawyer or somebody with animal law expertise, often to set up a trust for their animal to ensure that they're protected after their death. People have left tremendous amounts of money to their animals in their wills for their care post their death. I think there's actually examples of millions and millions of dollars in the US being left that way. But it's definitely an area that needs to be further developed in South Africa, because I think a lot of people don't tend to think of their animals and provide for their care. And importantly, because animals are property, they end up forming part of the estate. So they're not actually considered in the same way, for example, that a child would be. There are some progressive pieces of legislation around the world which start to look in the best interests of an animal, both in divorce and custody proceedings, as well as when somebody passes on. So I would say incorporating something like that into our legislation would avoid the consequence of animals being just grouped into the estate when somebody dies. I'd say it's an area we definitely should be developing in South Africa a bit more. And also considering people might want to leave donations to charities when they die. So again, I think there's a lot of very interesting work to be done there. And then the second one, the progressive realization of animal rights or outright protection. So again, I think there's the ideal situation and then there's the reality. Something like the environmental right, like as Dr. Berg has said, human rights are well protected. So arguing that it needs to be, for example, immediate in that instance is much more justifiable in many people's eyes. People are not yet at the stage in society where they can reasonably get on board with animal rights, at least not the vast majority. We see that from the very small percentage of, for example, vegans, right? And vegetarians or self-identified as such. So I don't think that the world is necessarily ready for that. I think the reality is that the progressive realization is going to be more tangible and feasible based on the fact that we're still very much in a welfare regime. I will say, though, that if we look at the rights of nature movement that's gaining real progression around the world, that could be potentially a segue to recognize the rights of non-humans, not necessarily directly animals first, but it might be a step in the process before we get there.
Thank you, Amy. We then have a question from JC, who is asking if horse racing is considered animal cruelty, and is your organization involved in any of that? And does the same apply, for example, to the chaining of dogs or using donkeys as transport in some places like Lesotho or Mafeking? And then there's another question about animal law reform and whether they can liaise with the body corporate ombudsman to get the ombudsman to be, more up to date about animal rights laws.
Great. So I'll speak to the first question about horse racing. I think definitely if we look at some of the footage and the work that's being done internationally, there's definitely cruelty that happens within the industry. I personally do not have enough information. I don't think we have investigations or enough data in South Africa that's at least publicly available. If it is, then absolutely it should be charged with animal cruelty in terms of the Animals Protection Act. I've done minimal amounts of it in terms of the Gambling Act, but it's not something that we're directly working on, but it is an important issue and should be prosecuted, absolutely, if there's cruelty to animals in any situation. And similarly for working animals, I think they also get a lot less attention. And it is very complex if we look at the social circumstances of many people who rely on these animals. So again, some of the social and economic factors need to be considered, but ultimately, if it's against the law in terms of being an offence, then it should be prosecuted as such and should be treated with the requisite attention and consideration that it deserves. The second question is about the body corporate. So I think it's something I honestly get about hundreds of queries around this. So it's something that's very important to people around either their animals being taken away or them not being allowed to keep animals in a body corporate. It seems to come up quite a lot. It's something I would love to work on if we had all the time in the world, but unfortunately we are severely overcapacitated with the amount of work that we have to undertake and the amount of people we have to do it as a nonprofit organization. But I will say there might be attorneys that would be interested. One of the things we do is we have a network of attorneys. So if there's somebody that specializes in property law that also wants to get involved in animal law, then potentially they could take it on and we could provide like ad hoc assistance. But it's not something we're directly working on in this instance.
Thank you, Amy. There's another question about legal personality. And the question is, the legal personality afforded to corporations, is that something we can take from and apply that to animals?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's something I'd love to do a lot more further research on. But if you look at the Constitution again, it grants rights to humans, and then it also grants rights and duties correspondingly to corporations and other entities, which means that we've already recognized that something that isn't a human can already have legal rights. And if we take that exact same recognition and we look at expanding it further and we look at the rationale for why we've granted corporations, for example, legal rights, it's because they exist in our society. It's because they need to be held accountable. It's because they should be the subject of duties, and they do have rights. And they also have people acting on their behalf, for example, in the same way that animals would need to have people acting on their behalf because they can't approach the courts. So I think that area of expanding protections beyond non-humans, whether that be corporations who already have them, to nature and to animals, is definitely something that we can do, looking at, for example, amending the Constitution, Section 8, as it applies to these different entities. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Amy. There is a question from Yolanda. Yolanda, would you like to put your camera on and your microphone? I see that Yolanda has raised her hand. Yolanda, are you here? Yolanda, you can type your question as well into the chat, and then I'm going to move on to another question perhaps while we wait. So Amy, something that I find, and I think it's important to distinguish or clarify, and I see some of my students are in this session as well, is there seems to be a perception that animal welfare and rights of nature is the same thing or the same movement and the same type of law and discussion. And I was wondering whether you can clarify or elaborate on that.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I think in many ways, as I mentioned, expanding the notion of rights beyond the human species or corporations, as we just mentioned, allows us to widen our circle of compassion in our legal system in a way that provides us with other role players to have a seat at the table. And that is critically important, right? So granting rights to nature doesn't automatically mean that suddenly people can't cut down trees or things like that. It means that there is designated laws that protect nature and its rights. There are designated legal representatives, and the law and judges need to consider that in the regime, right? So in many ways, the same arguments for expanding rights to nature can be used to expand rights to animals, because we're broadening our circle as to who we grant legal consideration. Animals are distinguishable, though, also from nature because they are sentient beings. So, you know, for example, an individual tree or an individual animal would need to be considered individually. There's an interesting court case out of Ecuador, who was the first country to recognize rights of nature in its constitution, where the court very, very recently interpreted the rights of nature to apply directly to individual animals. So before that, it was very unclear as to whether the rights of nature could apply to individual animals in the country, but the court made an explicit statement that that in fact is the case. And if you look at the law of Chile, they're looking at also expanding their constitution right now to include rights of nature, and within it, they also explicitly recognize the rights for animals. So I wouldn't say they necessarily go hand in hand. Of course, granting nature rights will get better protection for animals, but it might not get better protection for individual animals. So we might, for example, see them clash in the case of invasive species, where you can still kill animals and the rights of nature trumps that. So it's quite a complicated relationship, but ultimately I think it will have positive developments for advancing the movement.
I completely agree. I think that giving those almost blanket rights, it does mean that individual animals can fall through the cracks. I see that there are movements towards to have a declaration on the right to water and the right of the skies, dark skies, not to have so much light pollution, and those are great movements.
Yeah,
but we should also focus on more targeted movements, I think. So we do have a question from Yolanda. She wrote it in the chat. Are there currently initiatives addressed to regulate the breeding of companion animals?
So yeah, I think it's a massive issue. Again, it's happening, it's quite prominent. So in terms of initiatives, I say there's a lot of organizations working on it, but in terms of the legislation, I'd say it's a little bit slow. There are some bylaws. So I know Cape Town recently released a new bylaw, and with that, they limit the number of animals unless you have a permit. So that is one way of regulating breeders and ensuring, for example, that you don't have a massive amount of animals without at least getting some permitting. But obviously there's problems with enforcing that legislation. So I think for things like breeding, absolutely local legislation is a key way to try and do that. More needs to be done. But it is very complex because it also involves intellectual property rights and the Animals Improvement Act, right, which then starts to limit people's property rights. So we start to see that same sort of clash and how that interacts with the farming of animals for commercial purposes. So the breeding one is actually a very complicated issue, but it is one that deserves and warrants more attention. There's been a lot of efforts in the US and other countries, and I think we could use some of that legislation with the appropriate context change in South Africa too.
Great, thank you. We only have 3 minutes left, and the last question is about animal law reform, actually, and they want to know how the public can become more involved through the work of the animal law reform or any initiatives you might have. So I think, yeah, use the last few minutes to discuss that, and then we can wrap up.
Great, thank you. I think thank you for being interested in our work. It's always wonderful to hear that people are excited about what we're doing and want to be involved. I would encourage you to kind of start following our social media in terms of what we're doing, how we're getting involved. We have a page where people can fill in a form and provide us with details to volunteer. We're trying to build capacity. It's a very important thing for us. If we are going to have continuity as an organization and as a movement in animal law, we need people to be trained, to be doing this work, to understand the context and the work. So part of what we're doing is capacity building. So if you wanted to volunteer with our organization, you could email us at contact@animallawreform.org, reach out to us on Facebook, fill out the form. And if there's a particular thing you're interested in, and that becomes, for example, a government submission that we might want to work on, then absolutely we would love to involve you. We'd like to train you, work with you, and also hear your skills and expertise in those areas. So follow us, email us, and then we'll try our best to involve and incorporate as many people as we can.
Thank you. Amy, there is one more question.
Okay.
I think I'm going to let that in. The question is about linking human welfare with non-human welfare. And to my mind, that comes up in our constitution. And the question is, doesn't linking human well-being with non-human or animal well-being diminish animal well-being?
Great. It's a really fantastic question. And I think in some ways, absolutely yes, because it shows again that we only think that animals are worthy of protection because they impact our human interests. But as I said in the beginning, animals are important in their own right. I said first and foremost. And then as a third point, if we look at the reality of our systems, they are human-centric. We're an anthropocentric society. Our constitution is human-based. Our rights are human rights. Everything around our society is anthropocentric. If we want to make any sort of movement in our reality, we need to base it around how it impacts our society, how it impacts humans. That's always the first thing they say. If you approach government and you want to have a law reform, they say, well, what about the people? So practically speaking, of course, you need to approach it this way. At the same time you do it, you need to say, and it's important because animals have intrinsic value. Animals are sentient and animals are worthy. So I think as long as you have that narrative together and not just separately and say, oh, well, we're protecting humans, but we're actually broadly trying to protect animals and our environment, that's the way that I think we need to approach it, to have a truly intersectional approach.
Thank you, Amy. That is such a brilliant answer. And I think that we can speak about this topic for another hour and a half. It's such an important topic and it has a lot of interest, which I'm really grateful for. Thank you so much for joining us tonight all the way from the US. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This video is recorded, so it will be made available, I think, via the Law Faculty's YouTube channel, but also on the Global Environmental Law Center's webpage. So keep an eye out for that. And Amy, if we have your permission, we will then also make your slides available to anyone who asks or on our webpage. And then if you enjoyed today's webinar, next time, I think it's on the 1st of September, we have a webinar with Michelle Lim, who is also part of the IUCN, and she's actually going to speak about rights of nature and the law surrounding that, and perhaps reimagining environmental law to more adequately address rights of nature. So a related topic to this, and I look forward to that discussion. But thank you again, Amy. We really appreciated having you here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.